Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 48 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister.
Myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisis.ie.
Mark, good to see you as always. And obviously last week, you will recall, we had a fascinating discussion on the Kenny report, which was under the chairmanship of the former Supreme Court Judge John Kenny, with Tim Ryan, who's written a wonderful book about the report and its relevance today to housing issues and the difficulties we face in housing and land, getting land and relevant land that we can build on, etc. Yeah, it was brilliant, wasn't it?
I think it's a good read, and for anybody who wasn't aware of the Kenny report, it's an easy read.
Will you just give us the title of the book again? We should give it a mention.
It's Housing: A Missed Opportunity: The Tangled Story of the Kenny Report, published by Grand Canal Media and written by Tim Ryan.
No, it was really brilliant. It was really, really, really fascinating interview, I have to say. Well, today we're staying in the realm of politics, but always as a legal theme added in, Mark, of course. When we had Niamh Howlin in here a couple of weeks ago to discuss her book on the history of barristers in Ireland in the 20th century, we mentioned that one of her chapter headings concerned barristers and public life and public service. And today's guest knows all about that. He's Dublin MEP Barry Andrews. He has straddled both worlds. He was a practicing barrister for a number of years and then went into public life, so serving in the Dáil and now is currently MEP for Dublin. So really looking forward to talking to him.
Yeah. It's always interesting to hear somebody who's, shall we say, been on both sides of the fence, both sort of applying the law as a barrister or solicitor and then moving into the legislative side. And I think he, having been both a junior minister in Dublin and then now being in the European Parliament, I think it's interesting to hear that perspective.
No, absolutely. Really looking forward to that interview. But first to some cases that you have identified from the Decisis website. We're going to start with a very sad case. This concerns an infant who died at 5 days old following an emergency caesarean section. An inquest jury found that the death had been by natural causes, although they found that the hospital could review their procedures with regard to the use of OxyContin. A controversial drug, I think, but maybe I shouldn't say that because I'm not a medical expert. The parents, obviously, the heartbroken parents, challenged the natural causes verdict by judicial review, but the court said no, the jury found correctly.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, this is obviously an extremely sad case arising from the death of a 5-year-old infant. The issue here was that there was jury in the inquest and they reached the verdict of natural causes. But one of the things that a jury can do, as well as reaching a verdict, is to make recommendations in the public interest. And so what they said in this case, and obviously it was an issue raised by the parents' own legal team, was the use of OxyContin in the medical procedures. And basically the jury said that the hospital should review its procedures. But the ultimate finding was natural causes, which the parents were not happy with.
And it's important to say that a coroner is entitled to make a recommendation, or there is a specific phrase on it.
Recommendations in the public interest.
Yeah, in the public interest.
But where there's jury, it would be the jury making the recommendations rather than the coroner. But the issue here was that they sought to challenge both the verdict and the coroner's charge to the jury. And one of the things they said was that they didn't have the coroner's notes. And this arose on appeal. And of course, Mr. Justice Meenan in the Court of Appeal said, well, you didn't look for the notes by way of discovery in the High Court. So he didn't hold with them on that.
Would they have got the notes? I mean, acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, a coroner, would he be obliged to hand over his notes? I would have thought no.
Well, what the judge said here was that where they were represented and were able to take their own notes of the hearing, there was no particular reason to look for the coroner's notes, I think.
Okay. So that issue didn't arise. Okay, and I should say that this is the case of Rhys Spencer Cummins versus the coroner for Cork City, and it's a decision of Mr. Justice Charles Meenan.
That's right.
As you just said. Okay, case number 2. Next to a case where a receiver had been appointed over property, he sought vacant possession, but the borrowers were making life difficult for him. So he sought various interlocutory orders from the court, restraining the borrowers from interfering with the receivership and allowing him basically to get on with his business. Yeah,
this is a not uncommon problem when a receiver is appointed over land that the borrowers feel that the land shouldn't have been repossessed or the receiver shouldn't have been appointed. And sometimes, as happened in this case, try to effectively remain in possession, put their own tenants in place. And there was a suggestion here that somebody had actually been involved in making certain unlawful threats towards people. So the receiver basically sought an interlocutory order to grant him possession of the property and to restrain them from interfering. And The borrowers tried to suggest that they had entered into a restructuring agreement, again, with the original lender, not the lender who had appointed the receiver, but they failed to establish that there had been a restructuring agreement. The most they could show was that they had had certain meetings with the representatives of the lender. And they also sort of said, well, look, we have an equity of redemption in the property. We should be allowed to effectively, pay off our mortgage. But they couldn't establish that they had the funds to do that. And they also tried to suggest that there were unfair terms in the original contract. And again, they weren't able to point to any unfair terms.
So the judge wasn't having any of that.
Wasn't having any of it.
So I should say that this is the case of Fennell versus Riley. It's a High Court decision from Ms. Justice Nuala Butler.
That's correct.
Okay, so finally to a case where the HSE appealed from an order of the High Court declaring that they had an ongoing duty to provide mental health treatment to a former prisoner, obviously somebody who had obviously left prison, even though he had been unsuccessful in relation to a number of other orders sought, but he claimed that he was still entitled to be treated for his mental health. So this is the case of W versus the HSE. It's a Court of Appeal decision of, is it Ms. Justice Tara Burns or Mr. Justice Paul Burns?
I think this is Ms. Justice Tara Burns.
Tara Burns. Okay, very good. Tell us about this one, Mark.
So, well, as you said, it's a case involving a prisoner who had quite serious mental health difficulties, a history of violence, and he had been seeking certain orders in relation to the care that he was entitled to. Most of the orders were dismissed by the High Court, but what they did say was the Health Service Executive had ongoing duties to treat his mental health under existing legislation, and extraordinarily the Health Service Executive sought to appeal this finding. And I think if I just quote from what the judge said, that such a declaration is appealed against might be considered surprising as a reasonable interpretation of that declaration could be considered as confirming the duty on the respondent to provide the first named appellant with appropriate mental health treatment relevant to his medical needs, having regard to Section 7 of the Health Act 2004. So what they effectively said in the Court of Appeal was there is a statutory duty to look after his mental health, so the declaration was simply confirming the statutory duty. There's no reason why the HSE should have been appealing that order.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for that, Mark, and thank you for explaining those cases so well. Back shortly with MEP Barry Andrews.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So we are delighted to be joined in the studio today by Barry Andrews, MEP, who probably needs no introduction to most of our listeners. Barry comes from the well-known Andrews dynasty. His grandfather, Todd Andrews, wrote two very interesting books, Dublin Made Me and A Man of No Property, which I read many years ago and really enjoyed. His father, David Andrews, was both a barrister and TD and Minister for Foreign Affairs during the Good Friday Agreement negotiations. Barry's older brother, also David, took the more conventional route for the child of a TD and became a stand-up comedian. But Barry, being a bit edgier, decided to take the more precarious route and became a barrister and politician himself. So, we'll talk to you about your career, Barry, but thank you very much for joining us on the Fifth Court.
Great pleasure, Mark and Peter. Lovely to be here. I listened with great interest to how this podcast has been going so well, such a success. So congratulations.
Thank you for that, Barry.
So, your background obviously is your father was a barrister and a TD, and you followed in his footsteps. Most of our listeners obviously have a legal interest. How did you find following somebody who was a barrister? Did he give you good advice? Was it a help or a hindrance?
It was brilliant because, when I took a seat in the Dáil, so he was gone and I came in, but we were both in the law library for a period of time. So it was really cool. We used to go for coffee together and...
Did he ever lead you?
No, he never let me, but it was brilliant to just spend a bit of time with him. And, he's great personal skills, to see the way he interacted with people. Everybody's very fond of him, the staff, the other barristers, solicitors, clients, everybody. So he had a nice manner about him. Yeah,
gentleman.
Yeah. So it was lovely to see him in his sort of professional context. No, there was never advice. It was just, it was good to spend that time with him.
And how is he now? Is he still in good health? Or?
Yeah, I was with him last evening. We fed him and my mother, and he's 88. He's going to be 89 now in March, and he's a bit slower on the pins, but he's unfortunately there's no change in his personality.
So. No, your dad is wonderful, and I had the experience of working with him in the law library, and he's wonderful to work with. When I think of him as a politician, obviously he was a senior counsel and an eminent senior counsel. but he was foreign minister. He was Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Good Friday Agreement.
That's right. There are 4 signatories of the Good Friday Agreement. People sort of forget that. There's Bertie, is my father, and Mo Mowlam and Tony Blair. And so that's a real claim to fame, for him, and a source of huge pride. And then, so it's an incredible thing. I remember the period of 1998 very, very, very well, and the stress and the tantrums that were thrown, and all of the people walking away, people walking back, and that it ever happened in the end is a miracle, really.
Yeah,
a miracle.
Absolutely. So you yourself, as we said, became a TD in 2002. You took your father's seat. You'd been at the bar for 5 years by that stage. And during your career in the Dáil, you became what was described as a super junior minister. How did you find your experience as a barrister kind of informed your career then as a legislator? Do you think it's makes a difference to have seen the law sort of applied in practice?
Yeah, well, in fact, the reason I studied law was I wanted to go into politics, and so in the early 90s there were 3 main issues this particular year that I applied to the King's Inns to become a barrister. One was the X case, obviously heavily legal issues. Another was cabinet confidentiality that came out of the Beef Tribunal. And the other was the Maastricht Treaty itself, which was a source of huge debate. And each of them were just so heavily weighted.
This is 92, 93.
1992, 93. So I became a student in the King's Inns as a mature student in 1993. I did the diploma at night. And so it was really because I wanted to be a politician that could add some value. So I felt if you had a legal training, it would give you a much greater advantage. So when I became a backbencher in the Dáil, it definitely was a huge advantage to be able to read legislation, to understand its relationship with EU law, its relationship with the Constitution, to understand to some extent, and also to understand your powers as a backbencher, which were limited. But I think I was one of the first government backbenchers to introduce legislation. So I proposed
a private member's bill?
A private member's bill, which was called the Spent Convictions Bill. It eventually became law after my time, after I'd lost my seat. But, being able to take that initiative, and I got help from some of my colleagues in the bar, particularly Michael Chute, who some of your listeners will know, who helped me to draft the legislation. And, it was the right of initiative that perhaps a non-lawyer mightn't be aware of. And
so the spent convictions legislation, that meant effectively that after a certain period of time, you didn't have to disclose an old conviction, that effectively your presumption of innocence returned.
Yeah, correct. And it was the Rehabilitation of Offenders law in the UK, and it is described as a statutory lie. So you can say, based on this statute, that you don't have that conviction, and it doesn't extend to things like applying for visas, obviously, but it does apply for seeking employment, for insurance purposes. You can say, no, I don't have a conviction for certain categories of offence after a certain period of time.
Did you find your colleagues who weren't lawyers turned to you for advice? I mean, do you think it's a disadvantage to not have the training, if you know what I mean?
Yes, from time to time, they would ask me to, some help about various things. And but you know what? Most of the backbenchers particularly are kind of sole traders, and we didn't tend to work together. And there were lots of sources of advice, the Parliamentary Legal Council. There were advisors to various committees, particularly the heavy committees on, for example, the Committee on the Constitution. I was on that. There was a lot of lawyers involved. So it didn't happen that often, but from time to time, the non-lawyers, but there were a lot of lawyers in the Dáil at that time, but some of the non-lawyers would look for advice and help.
Can I ask you about that, Barry? I mean, that issue and drafting that piece of legislation, I mean, it's very much in a kind of a human rights vein. And you talked about getting into, joining the legal profession when all of those cases, the X case and various different cases, were kind of a background noise at the time when you were entering the profession. You then go in and become a politician, and you're a backbench TD. Is it disappointing? Do you come in brimming with kind of desire to change and to bring in legislative change? And you were very successful in that piece of legislation. But as you said, sometimes it was a bit frustrating being on the backbenches. You can't really do a lot. You're boxed in a small bit.
Yeah. It was the classic lobby fodder, and a number of us got together to try to set up a sort of backbench committee, like the 1922 committee in the Tory party over in the UK. And Bertie was the leader at that time of Fianna Fáil. And he dealt with the rebellion.
Didn't see that as any great advantage to him, did he?
No, he didn't. So he invited us to the party rooms on the 5th floor every Thursday throughout July at 7:30 in the evening. So as you can imagine, the rebellion petered out as a result. But yeah, I mean, there was always that frustration. I remember writing an article that was published in the Irish Times, and I kind of listed in order the 7 locuses of power in Ireland, including the courts, the European Union, the unions, because at that time partnership was very much social partnership. And, you go down the road, you find the backbenchers at the very end. So, what Bertie did, I mean, he was really very good with the backbenchers. He kind of expanded the ministries, the junior ministries. There are lots and lots of, I think there might have been 35 ministers at one point, and it was applied as a sort of political anaesthetic a sort of political chloroform for the rebellious backbenchers to give them something to do. But yeah, it was frustrating. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
And yet for a government with a small majority, each individual backbench TD needs to be kept happy. I mean, you say there isn't much power, but I mean, you always have the power to say, right, I'm going to walk.
Yes, we do, but that's really a nuclear option. And I think at that time, 2002-07, which the period I'm talking about, the economy was in good shape. It was people at that time were nostalgic about the heady days of the 80s when the Dáil was full of heaves and incredible stuff happening and terrible scandals. And in the 2002-07 period, it was very, very boring, really. And, so there was none of that excitement. But then, of course, you're careful what you wish for because, as soon as 2008
you were
came
re-elected
around.
in 2007, weren't you?
Yeah, I got elected in 2007. And then in 2008, I became a minister when Bertie Ahern stepped down. Brian Cowan became Taoiseach and he appointed me.
And Brian Cowan, I mean, he's a man who gets, a harsh press, I think. I mean, he found himself in circumstances that were very difficult. He had been Minister for Finance for a long time. He was Taoiseach, so the buck does stop with him. But, retrospectively looking back, he had a hard time, didn't he?
Yeah, I think so. I think, we would say that in that period, 2008-11, I was in the cabinet as a super junior, as you say, at the high chair of the cabinet. So we had Paul Gallagher, the Attorney General, Brian Leonard, who's the Minister for Finance, and Brian Cowan. And between the three of them and their three departments, they had to come up with NAMA, they had to come up with FEMPI, they had to come up with all of this architecture of recovery, including the plan that was eventually, sadly, tragically agreed with the Troika. And so the next government came in and implemented essentially what had been designed, frankly, in the period 2008-11. Now, that's my version, right?
Yes.
And I think Brian Cowan subsequently, when he spoke at various events in Georgetown University, he gave a very good speech around 2018, and also to the Finance Committee that tried to review what had happened. He gave his version as he saw it, And I think people are very fond of him. I had him over in Brussels recently. He was representing a business interest, and I went out for dinner with him, and it's just fantastic to see him out and about. He's got great friends and family, and he's in good shape.
He's back to himself because he went through a tough time medically.
He went through a tough time, yeah.
Participating in the Council of State there last week.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so he's in good. He's still physically not himself whatsoever, but he's in good shape and he's enjoying life to the best extent possible.
Can I just come in here? You got to tell us about the Troika. And I mean, at the time, you remember there was certain of your colleagues were on television and they were shaking their heads, no such thing, no Troika, no Troika. And then they landed. What was that like, being part of that cabinet? Obviously, there's cabinet confidentiality. We don't expect you to give away the family secrets. But can you tell us something about that?
Well, yeah, because, you mentioned my grandfather was in the independence, founding father. And by the way, I should also mention my grandmother spent a year in jail during the Civil War. And her history has been revived a little bit now by my sister. It's a really worthy thing. But so that was in my head as this was happening. So sovereignty was draining out the door of the cabinet. And I remember looking out the window onto the government buildings where the fountain is, and it was snowing very heavily at this time when we were making this decision, and we obviously had to go to the Dáil. And I did look out the window, and it was this scene of just absolutely beautiful out in government buildings. But I was very conscious that what my grandfather and grandmother had started, we had degraded. And it was a very profoundly difficult thing to be a part of, frankly. But, all we could do was get on with the job that was in front of us. And we all knew that Brian Lenihan was very sick at this time. And he sort of embodied what we were doing. He was going to get on with it. He was facing a terrible trauma and difficulty himself. And, that's all we could do. So, yeah, it was difficult.
So after you lost your seat in the great Fianna Fáil wipeout, shall we say, in 2011, I think it was, wasn't it? You spent a bit of time as CEO of Dáil, and then you were with Institute of International and European Affairs for a while, and then you were elected MEP for Dublin in 2019, isn't that right?
That's right.
By this stage, you've had experience of being a practicing barrister, you've had experience of legislating and being a minister, presumably guiding legislation in Ireland. What's the comparison between work in the Oireachtas and work in the European Parliament? Is there any comparison?
Well, there are some comparisons, but it's very, very different. It's very much based on the German model, whereas in the Dáil, there's a leader of the opposition. There's no leader of the opposition in the European Parliament. Whereas in the Dáil, they meet every week. The European Parliament meets once a month for 3 days. The committees have all the power in the European Parliament. The European Parliament is a hemicycle, whereas we have this fantastic kind of way of having political debate in our Parliament, which is much more like the UK model. So the Irish model of legislating is very different. The Irish model of politics.
Adversarial.
It's more adversarial, exactly is the word I was looking for. But, I make the point that 70% of our law here in Ireland comes from the European Union, but 90% of the drama comes from the Dáil.
Yeah.
So, and people love drama, of course, but the European Parliament is a little bit sterile by comparison.
You don't have the soap opera. You don't have people sitting there going, who's going to take over from who next week?
Exactly. There's none of that going on. I mean, when Farage and his ilk were in there, actually was probably more exciting. But after Brexit happened, they all left. The European Parliament became a fairly sterile place. And a lot of the speeches are very boring. They're very repetitive. There isn't as much debate as you would, being able to have the capacity for adversarial debate is very much rewarded in British politics and to some extent in Irish politics, but not so much in European Parliament, where specialisation is rewarded, expertise is rewarded in terms of getting on and advancing.
And what about your political colleagues? I mean, the MEPs who sit beside you and serve with you on those committees. I mean, is there an international commonality between politicians? I mean, is all politics local? Do they think the same way as we do?
No.
Are they trying to get people into the Guards? I mean, is that
No,
the sort of
they don't. You see,
philosophy, or is it completely different?
It's completely different because we have PRS TV, whereas they have list systems. So I met a Romanian guy the other day. He's not an MEP, but he said to me, I'm second on my list, so I'll see you in June. So he knows he's going to get
back.
Yeah, he's already going to get elected. And once you get high on your list and your party's 15%, you're 100% going to be elected in June. So that's the only threshold you have to get past. Whereas we eat what we kill in Ireland. You have to win your convention, which I did in 2019, and then you have to win your seat. And that's all about, getting the maximum number of first preferences, getting the maximum amount of transfers, and really grinding at an incredibly granular level. And I think personally that the Irish system has led to the sense that people are close to the European Parliament. Whereas there's a huge distance with the average voter in Germany or France with their MEP.
You think they're less connected with the European Parliament? Because I don't think most Irish people would feel particularly close to the European Parliament.
Yeah, well, much closer than their German or French equivalents. So, and this is particularly so with the Dáil compared to the French Assembly or the German Parliament. So I think that PRS TV system is like the terroir, if you like. And out of that is the flavour of politics. So I think that in Ireland we have a much better system. The proximity to the voter means that we have a much more stable system of government. The level of industrial action in Ireland after austerity, after the crash in 2018, was tiny because people said, right, I know we can get rid of these guys, and we can change the entire complexion of the government, which is what they did. Whereas in other countries, there's a sort of frustration, which leads to a lot of demonstrations, which leads to protests and strikes and civil unrest that we frankly haven't had in Ireland for an awful long time.
Can I just bring you back to your point that the legislation was really made in committee in Europe? So, I mean, when you are sitting in committee, again with the other MEPs, presumably the list for systems means that they can appoint people who have expertise in particular areas. And, I don't want to name names, but the nature of politics in Ireland is you'll get a certain number of people whose whose real purpose is to concern themselves specifically with local issues and really are elected on those rather than national issues. And once you get people like that elected at European level, I imagine their input in committee is relatively limited, or is that an unfair characterisation?
There's a space for every type of... You do have to have some expertise in the European Parliament, or otherwise you are irrelevant. So you're right about the other countries. So take, for example, Macron's party, Renaissance. So they have about 23 MEPs, and each one is an expert in their field.
A pre-existing expert.
Yeah, pre-existing expert. Right. Like there's an expert who's a lecturer or a professor of this, or a guy who was the head of a company, and this lady was a medical doctor, and all of them have this background of expertise in geopolitics and whatever it is, and they're picked one by one, and they get put on the system, and in they go. And they never really have to worry about a single plate of chicken and chips.
But are they political enough?
Well, this is the point.
Can they do politics? Because it's all about trade. It's all about understanding the other side. What can we get away with? Can we negotiate? It's all very well being an expert.
Yeah.
But you also have to, bring together, basically get consensus. And that is the art of politics. Obviously, you have to have knowledge, but you also have to have the skill of engaging with other people and getting a result.
Yeah, well, see, a good story just to illustrate that is, Phil Hogan was the agriculture minister before he became trade commissioner and the agriculture commissioner. So they were finalising the EU-Japan deal, the free trade agreement, and it was really stuck. Phil got on a plane and he went to Tokyo for 2 or 3 nights, and he basically glad-handed the Japanese, respected all of their customs. And
did the Phil Hogan.
He did the classic Phil Hogan. And then when the head of the French Farmers Union, his father passed away, and Phil showed up at the funeral. They were just stunned to see the European Commissioner for Agriculture.
So there was a little bit of Kilkenny all over Europe.
So yeah, that kind of political touch is valuable, I think. And then sometimes when you bring in people who have never run for a council seat, never run for never had to canvass door to door, never had to really respond to the granular concerns of ordinary people. Yeah, you do lose something.
Barry, you said a great phrase there. You said, Europe is responsible for 70% of the legislation and the Dáil is responsible for 90% of the drama. It's a great phrase, okay? How do you change that? How do you make the Irish public aware of the fact that the way they live their lives, a lot of the decision-making is being made in Europe, and it's very progressive generally. You can say, it's an unelected body over there, but they are elected. But how do you change that perception where people tune into the fact that Europe is so significant?
Well, you have to make it relevant. So I'm dealing with the forced labour instrument at the moment. We voted on it 2 days ago or last week in Strasbourg. And the forced labour instrument is a product ban placing products that are tainted with forced labour on the single market. So how do I make that relevant? Well, 2 weeks ago, the New Yorker published an article about the Chinese distance fishing fleet that has forced labour in it, and the fleet and the processing plants on the east coast of China. And this seafood is making its way into European supply chains. And Tesco, Lidl, Aldi and Musgraves are all mentioned in the report. So now I have a kind of a hook, and I can explain to people that fish finger you have may well have modern slavery is as part of that supply chain. And then you can talk about the forced labour instrument. And equally with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that I'm also working on, it's a mouthful, and even you guys are looking at me. But what that forces large companies to do is to check their supply chain for both human rights and environmental damage. So again, I've been working on the fast fashion area, which people understand. Sure. They know they can buy T-shirts for €2 on Shein. And now you can say, well, you know why that is? Because these guys don't pay their staff. You had the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh.
Yes.
There's terrible abuses of workers. And so you can bring the matter into their lives, into their daily lives, and say, well, by the way, we're fixing this. And we have a law called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And hopefully that will be transposed into Irish law.
Do you think it was one of the French technocrats that came up with the name of that legislation?
Well, there's this long story behind it. It was meant to be 2 pieces of legislation. It was meant to be corporate sustainable governance, and then it was meant to be a due diligence directive, 2 separate ones, but they brought them together, and hence it's... So CS3D is where we landed.
Okay. I was listening to a colleague of yours there recently, and he was talking about, that in one way politics has crept in a little bit more into the European Parliament and into the European Union generally. he was saying where once everything was motivated by science and kind of rational reason and thinking, whereas now there's a lot of kind of state interference which is stopping certain developments. And you know, a lot of the progressive things that happened that we have benefited from greatly in Ireland, I believe, mightn't have happened if there was more political interference.
Yeah, so there's two things that have happened. One is that the European Parliament has got more power, but also there's been a shift in power from the Commission to the Council. So there is only a fraction of the infringement proceedings that would have happened under Barroso's commission in the noughties are now happening. So instead of protecting the constitution of the European Union, they're now protecting the member states and membership itself. And so they're steering well clear of crises with the member states, and that is degrading, if you like, the quality of the legislation and the speed of the legislation getting through the system. And the European Parliament now has much more of a role since Lisbon. So it is much more political. And
So can I just...
but frankly, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
For the reasons we were talking about earlier on.
You're effectively saying that since the European Parliament has more power, the quality of the legislation is going down.
No, the speed of I meant to say the speed of the legislation
Right.
is slowing down. I mean, from time to time, the system can produce fast legislation. I mean, the digital COVID certificate probably the best example of something, a regulation that went through in super quick time as soon as we got vaccinations. But generally, things are a little bit slower, a little bit more bogged down. I mean, the classic example is the Migration and Asylum Pact, which has been bogged down since 2010. I think it was first proposed by the Commission, was re-proposed again in 2018, and then again in 2020. And we are very close, actually, here with the Migration and Asylum Pact, but it is 13 years later.
And I mean, just going back to the Lisbon Treaty, I mean, effectively the system now is co-decision, isn't that right? Whereas before the Lisbon Treaty, the Parliament would debate these things and could effectively be ignored by the Commission and the Council, who would then just make the decision. Whereas now the Parliament has to approve legislation, isn't that right?
Correct. So the first stage is the Parliament reading, then the Council gets to do its general approach, and then you get into trilogues together. But the right of initiative is still with the Commission, and that's a real bone of contention because, like I mentioned earlier, when I was a backbencher in the Dáil, in that Parliament, I was able, as a member of the Parliament, to initiate a piece of legislation. That's not something that is available to MEPs to initiate a piece of legislation. That only comes from the Commission.
And can legislation be kind of brought in by the back door by amending sort of the legislation that comes before you from the Commission?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the Commission will make a proposal. We will apply our amendments. The Council will announce their general approach. It can go back and forth a little bit, but then you get into the trilogues, which is the final part of it. We are currently in trilogues on CS3D, by the way, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And so we will try to make sure that the final directive has as much of the imprint of the Parliament on it as is possible. But the member states are very much pushing back. And one particular issue is the size of companies that it applies to. So in Germany, the German supply chain law applies to companies with 5,000 employees or more, whereas our proposal is for 500 employees or more. So that's going to be a serious
Can I get into more sort of political philosophy type questions? Barry, you're there now 4.5 years and you're up for election in, I think it's June. It's not May anymore. It used to be always in May, but it's in June. We wish you well. Obviously, we have to wish everybody well in that election, but we do wish you well in relation to that. Okay, so I was going to say you have a front row seat in the European Union. You're actually on the stage. You're a player there. Does it work? You've been there now 4.5 years. When you fly home from Brussels after a long time and you've put in the hours, etc., are you saying this is working? This is good?
Yeah,
it's all good? It's the question is, we're always faced with existential crises. Will the EU survive? It's a bit of a Daily Mail thing, And I think that the EU, in my time, and just let me talk about 2020 onwards, because I didn't actually come in until 2020, Peter, if you remember. Yes. I was one of these deep freeze MEPs.
Slightly delayed.
Slightly delayed. But anyway, the pandemic started 20 minutes after I took my seat. And I think the European Union did exceptionally well around the pandemic, not just on the procurement and distribution of vaccines, not just on the digital COVID certificate, but the whole next generation EU recovery and resilience facility, the idea of raising mutual debt for the first time ever. It was inconceivable that something like that would happen at EU level, but that all happened as a response to the pandemic. And we were much better, where the sum was much greater than the parts. And then we've had Ukraine. And whatever your views are on the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the European Union's response has been incredibly united. there's a lot of unity around sanctions. There have been some issues there. But providing a roadmap for Ukrainian membership of the European Union, providing support, humanitarian support for Ukraine, all of that has been incredible. And if you go back to Brexit, the European Union's response has been incredible. Managed migration okay. They managed to take some of that off the table. But I think the European Union has done exceptionally well during the last 4 years.
Okay.
I would make an exception, by the way, for the last 2 weeks.
Yes.
Which has
so
been
I have to ask you about that. Okay.
very,
As you
very
say, they're all on message in relation to Ukraine, and there's been a consistent approach in relation to that. We know there's been some discontent expressed on this island in relation to the attitude of the European Union in relation to the Israeli-Palestine issue that's all pervasive at the moment. Like, what do you think of that? I mean, are we out of sync? Do you have any views on that?
In my group, there's 100 MEPs, and we've got 22 countries represented we don't have any Portuguese MEPs, for example. But the German MEPs were very, very strong in saying, this is an historical issue for us.
Yes.
And
we can understand that, of
and
course.
that's perfectly understandable. And there are other countries that have the same concern, that they carry this historical memory that it informs the way they approach these political issues. But there were Spanish that spoke up the same as I did. There were French MEPs in my group that spoke up the same as I did. So there was a very significant number of people. Ireland was not out of step on this, in my opinion, not in the European Parliament. So the one issue we were pulling at, we finally came up with a resolution last week in Strasbourg. And the debate around the resolution went back and forth. It started out, the resolution said, the European Parliament supports Israel. That changed to the European Parliament supports the people of Israel. And then it changed back to the European Parliament supports the government and the people of Israel. And, that was where the debate was going on. But it started out very much, the flag of Israel went up on the Berlin Mont. Ursula von der Leyen and Robert Metsola went over to and never questioned Israel's tactics, shall we say, in asserting its right of self-defense, and never insisted on humanitarian law. All of that was really, really bad. I think that's all been pulled back. And it wasn't just Ireland that did it. Let's be very clear.
But Ireland
There's a lot of countries that are very unhappy with it.
There was a wonderful interview with Naomi O'Leary, who's the Irish Times Brussels correspondent, who I'm sure you know well. Mm-hmm. And she talked about how her colleagues out there were all saying, wow, Ireland seems to be, very strong on this and seems to be at odds with generally the philosophy in Europe. Did you find that?
Again, it wasn't my experience. We had lots of MEPs that took that position, and when Varhelyi, the commissioner for DG NEAR, he said that we were going to suspend all aid to Palestine, to Gaza. It wasn't just Ireland that raised an objection to it. It was Denmark, Luxembourg, one other. There was 4 countries that raised an objection to it. So we weren't by ourselves, but there is no doubt that Ireland's voice in this area was very, very clear. And it was really astonishing to see how united actually people were in Ireland around this issue. Not criticizing Israel, absolutely accepting that this was a terrible atrocity,
and they were
that they had a right
horrors,
to self-defense. But at the same time, you can't cherry pick international law. International humanitarian law insists that we've all heard the arguments at this stage. So I think we were very clear, very reasonable and practical in all those issues.
As a more sort of general question, I mean, you've been there for nearly 5 years, you're up for re-election. Is there any change that you think could be made to the treaties or to the structure that would make the work of the Parliament more effective?
Well, I think the right of initiative for the European Parliament would be very helpful.
Of course, yeah.
I think that's a really important one. I think we need to also recognise the European Union's competences in the area of health, in particular public health, because this is not going to be the last pandemic. We're going to have to deal with this repeatedly, I think, and that we've clearly seen that the Union works better than individual member states, and smaller member states in particular. So we benefited from the European Union's scale in a huge way. I think in the area of trade, we need to do more. We've fallen back very much on the free trade agreements that we had in the past. So the New Zealand Free Trade Agreement is coming up for ratification in the next few weeks. We have to, I think, expand those free trade agreements as well. So I think that's where there's 2 areas I think we're falling behind in particular.
Barry, we have a producer out there who's frantically waving at me through the window because we could talk forever. We could keep this going forever. Right. We have a little question at the end. Yes. You might be familiar with that. Book or a movie that you'd like to recommend to our listeners? Anything at all. I mean, you can go beyond the world of politics and law if you want.
Yeah,
Can be anything
well,
you
I
want.
mean, I read Oppenheimer over the summer, the famous book about that ended up in a movie, and it was really, really brilliant. It's the only kind of book you can only read in the summer holiday. But I'm currently reading Great Hatred, Little Room, which is Jonathan Powell's account of the Good Friday Agreement and all of that period. He was Blair's chief of staff. Very, very highly recommended. It's not written in a very, very great way, but it really helps you to, because I do a lot of work on Brexit, on sort of Northern Ireland, and try to add the Brussels voice into the Belfast issues that are there. And but it's also relevant now. People are talking about the Good Friday Agreement, the context of what's happening in Gaza and in Israel.
Jonathan Powell, wow. Whose brother was Charles Pole.
Oh.
Yeah, he was chief advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
Okay, but he called himself Pole as opposed to
Powell.
Anyway.
I'd recommend that. That's a great book.
Great, wonderful. And how about a movie?
Yeah,
Die Hard, Mad Max, any of those?
I went to see Oppenheimer, of course, and when we was walking out of Oppenheimer, there's a guy behind me says, "I much preferred Barbie." He said.
Barry, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for joining us in the Fifth Court.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can I say a huge thank you to our guest, MEP Barry Andrews, who came in and just talked so freely about his experiences out in Brussels, his background, his interesting family history. I really enjoyed that interview, Mark.
Absolutely. I understand he was on his brother's podcast as well, which would have been a rather different experience, which I think is called And That's Why We're Not Together. It's a podcast that his brother does with his former wife.
We messed up big time in not asking him about that. But anyway, we might get him in again. You never know. You never know. Okay, so that's all from this edition of the show. Can I thank our producer, Conal O'Moran, for all his assistance in putting this show together, and to the great Lee Brennan for recording this show and doing such a wonderful job. So from me, Peter Leonard,
and myself, Mark Tottenham,
that's all for this show, and we shall see you soon in the Fifth Court.